Most of the roles I got, people came after me. Universal, I helped write the pictures, put them on, so I never experienced that.
When Don Knotts passed away in 2006, millions of fans mourned the loss of one of television's most beloved comedians. Known for his unforgettable role as the nervous yet lovable Deputy Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show, Don's legacy seemed untouchable. A man who brought laughter to every living room across America. But behind the goofy grin and awkward charm was a life full of secrets, pain, and deep loneliness that few ever saw. For years, his daughter, Karen Knotts, kept silent about the real story behind her father's private world, a world that stood in stark contrast to the cheerful characters he played on screen. She watched him struggle through heartbreak, crippling self-doubt, and battles with mental health, all while the world saw him as comedy's greatest clown. Now, at 71, Karen has finally decided to break her silence, revealing the truths she once swore to keep hidden. Truths that cast Don's life and legacy in a completely new light. What she reveals isn't just the story of a Hollywood icon. It's the story of a man haunted by his own fears, driven by insecurity, and desperate to prove he was more than the small-town deputy fans adored. As Karen puts it, "My father was the funniest man in America, but he wasn't laughing inside. This is the heartbreaking truth behind the man who made America laugh." And the daughter, who finally felt strong enough to tell the world what really happened. Long before Don, Knotts became a household name. He was just a shy, nervous boy growing up in Morgantown, West Virginia, a place where laughter was rare and hardship was constant. Born in 1924, Don's childhood was marked by poverty and pain. His father, a man deeply scarred by World War I, suffered from severe mental illness and bouts of rage. His mother did her best to keep the family together, but the household was often filled with fear rather than comfort. For young Don, humor became a shield, the only way to escape the dark reality surrounding him. Karen Knotts, his daughter, would later reveal that her father rarely spoke about those early years. He didn't want to relive them, she said softly in an interview. His childhood wasn't funny, it was terrifying. Comedy was how he survived it. That quiet confession gave fans their first glimpse of the boy who would one day become America's favorite nervous deputy. A boy who learned that laughter could mask pain better than tears ever could. Don's escape came through imagination. He would entertain his classmates by pulling faces, mimicking teachers, and creating characters out of thin air. But behind every laugh was a deep well of insecurity. He never saw himself as talented or handsome. Even in adulthood, those doubts never truly left him. When he finally moved to New York to pursue acting, Don was terrified of failure. The entertainment industry in the 1950s was ruthless, especially for someone as awkward and unassuming as him. But Don had something no one else did: authenticity. He didn't try to be cool or slick. He embraced his nervousness and turned it into comedy gold. His first big break came with The Steve Allen Show, where his quirky expressions and nervous energy made him an instant favorite. Then came The Andy Griffith Show, the role that would define him forever. As Barney Fife, the bumbling deputy of Mayberry, Don became a television legend. Week after week, millions of viewers laughed at his exaggerated expressions, high-pitched voice, and nervous body language. He won 5 Emmy Awards for his performance. But behind the laughter, the insecurities only deepened. Karen would later say that success made her father even more anxious. He loved being Barney, she said, but he also felt trapped by him. He was afraid people would never see the real Don Knotts, the man, not the clown. That fear haunted him throughout his career, even when he starred in hit movies like The Ghost and Mr. Chicken or The Incredible Mr. Limpet. He worried that audiences were laughing at him, not with him. Behind closed doors, Don was quiet and introspective. He wasn't the kind of man to attend glamorous Hollywood parties or bask in fame. Instead, he preferred solitude, reading, writing, and watching television in silence. Karen recalled that her father often looked distant, as if he were trapped in his own thoughts. He'd spend hours sitting alone, thinking, she said. I didn't realize until much later that he was battling depression. Don's mental health struggles were something he never discussed publicly. In an era when men, especially public figures, were expected to appear strong and confident, admitting to anxiety or depression could destroy a career. So Don hid it the only way he knew how: through laughter. Each nervous twitch, each exaggerated gag on screen, was a performance not just for his audience, but for himself, a way to push back against the darkness that followed him. As his fame grew, Don's personal life began to fracture. His long working hours and emotional distance strained his marriages. His daughter Karen often felt she had to compete with the character of Barney Fife for her father's attention. Yet despite his flaws, she adored him. He was gentle, she said. He never raised his voice. He just carried a sadness that never really went away. By the time the Andy Griffith Show ended, Don was both a national treasure and a deeply lonely man. The laughter he created for millions could fill rooms, but not the quiet ache within his heart. When the Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, Don Knotts found himself at a strange crossroads. For nearly a decade, he had been the beating heart of Mayberry, the insecure but lovable deputy everyone adored. But now, without Barney Fife, he wasn't sure who Don Knotts really was. The fame that once lifted him had begun to feel like a heavy mask he could no longer remove. Karen Knotts remembers how her father struggled after leaving the show. People thought he'd be happy, she said, but he felt lost. Barney Fife was his safety net. He knew that character inside and out. When it was over, he wasn't sure if he could ever top that. The pressure to live up to his past success took a toll on him, both mentally and emotionally. Hollywood wasn't kind to actors who played such distinctive roles. Producers didn't see Don as versatile. They saw him as the funny, nervous guy. Every script that came across his desk felt like a shadow of Barney Fife, and Don began to worry that his career had already peaked. He used to say he was a prisoner of his own creation, Karen recalled. He loved Barney, but he wanted to be more than just the punchline. Still, Don refused to give up. He threw himself into film, starring in a series of light-hearted comedies like The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, The Shakiest Gun in the West, and The Reluctant Astronaut. These films did well enough to keep him in the spotlight, but critics often dismissed them as silly or childish. Behind his trademark grin, Don took those words to heart. Every negative review fed his self-doubt, deepening his fear that he was little more than a novelty. At home, the toll of fame became harder to ignore. Karen describes her father as quiet and withdrawn, often lost in thought. When he wasn't working, he'd just sit and stare out the window, she said. Sometimes he'd laugh at something on TV, but it always felt forced, like he was trying to remind himself what laughter felt like. His relationships also suffered. Don's first marriage to Catherine Metz, Karen's mother, ended in 1964, right in the middle of his success on The Andy Griffith Show. His dedication to his work had created an emotional distance that couldn't be repaired. A second marriage years later also fell apart. The man who made millions laugh couldn't seem to find happiness for himself. In private, Don began to confide in Karen about his fears. He'd tell me that sometimes he felt like a fraud, she said. He thought that if people knew how nervous and insecure he really was, they'd stop laughing altogether. For Don, laughter was both his greatest gift and his greatest burden. It brought him success, but it also became the mask he wore to hide his pain. As the 1970s rolled on, Don began to experience severe bouts of anxiety and depression. He suffered panic attacks before performances and would sometimes lock himself in dressing rooms, too terrified to face the audience. Yet, once the cameras rolled, he transformed. The anxiety disappeared, replaced by the goofy, lovable energy fans expected. It was like watching a switch flip, Karen said. The moment he heard action, he wasn't Don Knotts anymore. He was whoever he needed to be. One of his few bright spots during this time was reuniting with his old friend Andy Griffith. Their bond, though tested by time and distance, remained strong. Andy saw through Don's humor and recognized the pain he tried so hard to hide. Andy was like a big brother, Karen said. He was the only one who could make my dad truly laugh. Despite his struggles, Don continued working well into the 1980s and 1990s, appearing in shows like Three's Company and lending his voice to animated films. His performances still carried the same magic, but they came from a man who was increasingly weary inside. Karen recalled, "He told me once, the hardest part about being funny is pretending you're okay when you're not." Behind the smiles, the truth was heartbreaking. Don Knotts, the man who made the world laugh, was slowly fading into a quiet sadness that fame could never heal. When MASH reached its later seasons, it was no longer just a television show, it was a cultural phenomenon. Millions of viewers tuned in every week, not merely to laugh, but to feel something real. The series had grown from a quirky wartime comedy into a deeply human exploration of life, loss, and survival. But with that transformation came a different kind of pressure, one that began to quietly strain the cast behind the scenes. Loretta Swit, who portrayed Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan, once revealed that success can be both a blessing and a burden. The show had made each actor a household name, yet it also chained them to an emotional intensity few could sustain for long. "We weren't just acting," Loretta said years later. "We were living those moments." By season 8, exhaustion had started to take its toll. The long shooting hours, emotionally demanding scripts, and the haunting subject matter of war began to affect the mental health of the actors. Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye, found himself increasingly consumed by the serious undertones of the later seasons. While he valued the show's shift toward moral reflection, the constant weight of tragedy wore him down. "It stopped being comedy," one cast member later recalled. "We were walking through pain." For Wayne Rogers, who played Trapper John, creative frustration had been his breaking point years earlier. He left after feeling that the writing had increasingly revolved around Hawkeye, leaving little space for his own character to grow. McLean Stevenson, who portrayed Colonel Henry Blake, followed a similar path. Tired of playing second fiddle, he left seeking broader opportunities. Yet, his shocking on-screen death, shot down over the Sea of Japan, would become one of television's most unforgettable moments. Loretta Swit remembered how the entire cast cried while filming that episode. "We knew we were losing more than a co-star," she said. "We were losing a part of the show's soul." It was a moment that haunted them for years. As the 1970s rolled into the 1980s, the industry itself began to change. Television networks were demanding higher ratings, faster production, and bigger emotional payoffs. But MASH was never built for speed. It thrived on slow, meaningful storytelling, moments of silence that said more than words ever could. The increasing studio pressure to deliver something bigger only amplified tensions on set. For Loretta, the evolving tone of MASH became both her greatest pride and deepest conflict. Her character, Margaret, had grown from a one-dimensional comic relief figure into a layered, complex woman torn between duty and vulnerability. Yet, behind that evolution was an actress longing for renewal. "I loved her," Loretta said, "but I didn't want to become her forever." Several of her co-stars shared similar sentiments. Gary Berghoff, who played the beloved Radar O'Reilly, eventually left the series after realizing that the emotional demands were draining his spirit. He later admitted, "Radar was pure, but I wasn't sure I could stay that way." By the time MASH entered its final stretch, many of the original faces had disappeared. The show had matured into something deeper, perhaps even heavier than intended. And although it continued to win awards and shatter viewership records, behind the laughter, the atmosphere had changed. The cast had grown older, wiser, and more introspective, and the fictional camp of the 40 Hottest 27th had begun to feel eerily real. Loretta once reflected, "The end wasn't about ratings or money, it was about letting go with grace." She described how each goodbye, each departure, felt like peeling away a layer of their own identity. "We loved each other too much to pretend it didn't hurt." When the final season approached, every cast member felt it. The jokes weren't as loud, the laughter wasn't as easy. They knew the time had come to say farewell, not only to the show, but to the version of themselves they had become through it. And as the cameras rolled for the last time, Loretta Swit looked around the set that had once been her second home. She later admitted, "It wasn't just the end of a show, it was the end of an era." But before MASH could truly say goodbye, Loretta and the remaining cast had one final message to share, one that would make television history. When the final season of MASH began production in 1982, there was an unmistakable feeling that something sacred was coming to an end. After more than a decade of laughter, tears, and unforgettable storytelling, the cast of the 4077th knew they were about to close one of television's most cherished chapters. But for Loretta Swit, that goodbye was deeply personal. She later revealed that she could barely hold back tears during those final days on set. "Every scene felt like a farewell," she said. "Every laugh, every hug, it all carried a kind of sadness we couldn't hide." What had once been a bustling, spirited production now felt like a family preparing for one last dinner together before everyone went their separate ways. The cast and crew were aware that their farewell episode needed to be something extraordinary. Titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, it would become the longest finale in television history, running for over 2 hours. When it aired on February 28, 1983, it drew an audience of more than 100 million viewers, a record that still stands as one of the most watched moments in American television. Behind the cameras, the mood was a mix of exhaustion and heartbreak. Alan Alda, who directed the finale, struggled to balance his emotions while guiding the crew. "We weren't just saying goodbye to characters," he once explained. "We were saying goodbye to a way of life." For Loretta, that last episode was particularly difficult. Her character, Major Margaret Houlihan, was given one of the most heartfelt goodbyes of all. She had evolved from a strict, by-the-book nurse into a compassionate, independent woman who symbolized the strength of those who served. Loretta said that when she filmed Margaret's farewell scene with Hawkeye, she couldn't stop crying. It was real emotion. "I wasn't acting anymore." Over the years, fans have often wondered why the cast truly left MASH when it was still wildly successful. Loretta finally addressed that question in her later interviews. "We were proud of what we'd done," she said softly, "but emotionally, we had nothing left to give. It was time to let go before we began repeating ourselves." She explained that many cast members were struggling with burnout. The emotional depth of the scripts, often tackling death, trauma, and moral conflict, had taken a toll. The laughter that once came easily now felt heavy. "You can only live in that kind of pain for so long," she admitted. Loretta also revealed that the bond between the cast was one of the main reasons they were able to keep the show alive for so long. "We loved each other fiercely," she said. "When someone left, it hurt, but we always understood." That understanding was what allowed them to say goodbye with dignity, without bitterness or regret. When the final scene wrapped, there was silence on the set. No one wanted to move. The iconic sound of helicopters faded for the last time, and as the lights dimmed, many of the actors broke down in tears. Loretta said she hugged every person on set that day. Grips, camera operators, extras, because she knew she might never see them again. After the finale aired, MASH became more than just a memory. It became a legacy. Viewers across the world wrote letters describing how the show had touched their lives, how it had made them laugh through pain and find hope in impossible situations. Loretta Swit received thousands of fan messages, thanking her for portraying a woman of strength and compassion during an era when few female characters were given such depth. In the years that followed, Loretta continued to speak fondly of her time on MASH. She turned down numerous offers to reprise her role, saying that some stories are meant to remain untouched. "We ended it right," she said, "with love, honesty, and truth." Before her passing, Loretta confirmed the real reason the cast had walked away. Not out of anger or fading fame, but out of respect for each other, for their craft, and for the audience who had stood by them through every laugh and tear. Her final words about MASH remain some of the most touching ever spoken about the show. Some people say, "We ended too soon." I say we ended perfectly. Because when something means that much to your heart, you have to let it go before it stops meaning everything. And just like that, the 477th faded into television history, its laughter echoing softly through time, reminding generations that even in the darkest places humanity endures.